Okay, so we are going to continue our lecture on Islam in Southeast Asia. Remember, we talk about the scripture of Islam, which is the Qur'an, the recitation. Muslims believe sent down to the Prophet, the last Prophet Muhammad, uh, through Archangel Gabriel in the city of Mecca and Medina. And it contains belief, ethics, stories, relationship between humans and other humans and the divine. So that's the content of the Quran. You also have the commentaries of the Quran in Southeast Asia. So commentaries meaning interpretation, right? Some interpretations in Malay, in Indonesian language, for example. So where you have Muslims interpreting the meanings of the Quran. Even though you have Muslims reciting the Quran in Arabic, they still need to learn the meanings of the Arabic Quran so that they can understand and then they can apply the teachings in the Quran in their daily lives. One of the commentaries of the Quran, this is by way of just introduction, by the name of Hamka. It's called the Tafsir al-Azhar, which means the commentary of al-Azhar. This particular commentary of the Quran is reformist in orientation, which means, try to combine tradition and the modern, how you can use the Quran in order to change society, in order to change the the character of the people in Indonesian and Malay world. This particular tafsir or commentary also was targeted to the youth, the young generation, and also preachers, so that they can preach Islam in a reformist way. And it has sources, Arabic sources, Arabic commentaries of the Quran, and also Malay, and some Sufi or mystical interpretation of the Quran. This particular tafsir also encourages Muslims or the people of Islam to have a critical reasoning, critical thinking when they understand the Quran. So some of the characteristics of this commentary of the Quran, to give you a sense of, how the scripture has been interpreted in order to serve the peoples in Southeast Asia. Then you also have translation itself. So commentary of the Quran, you have a broader and lengthier interpretation or commentaries of the Quran. But translation is simply, like word by word translation. You do have translation of the Quran in Thai language, in Vietnamese language, in Malay language, Indonesian language, Javanese language, and so forth and so on in Southeast Asia. So this is an example of how the Quran and its translation look like. You have the Arabic, if you see that Arabic part, right? The Arabic section is the Quran. This is one of the chapters of the Quran. And then you have the translation side by side, okay? So the Quran and translation, or Indonesian translation, side by side. So that's how the Quran and translation looks like in Indonesia. Beside the Quran and interpretations and translation, you also have Qur'anic calligraphy. It's a form of arts, art of writing in Arabic. So you have Muslims engaged in learning and teaching how to write the Quran in Arabic beautifully. So you have a calligraphy, different styles of writing, they learn and then they teach also. And usually you will see this Qur'anic calligraphy in the mosque, yeah, maybe on the walls of the mosque, or sometimes also on the walls of Islamic schools in Southeast Asia. So that's a calligraphy. That's one of the artistic expression, that they get from the Quran. All right, that's the Quran and translation and interpretation and calligraphy. How about Islam and the states or nation states in Southeast Asia? Let's talk one by one. Yeah, we start, talking about Indonesia. Islam in Indonesia. One of the characteristics of Islam in Indonesia is that most Muslims in this particular country, Indonesia, have accepted or endorsed the state philosophy called Pancasila. Pancasila from Sanskrit means the 5 pillars. The 5 pillars. So because they have these 5 pillars as the state philosophy, believe in one God, humanism, nationalism, democracy, and social justice. That's the short, versions of the 5 pillars. And then they also accepted 1945 Constitution, which is not a religious constitution. It's basically semi-secular constitution because there is no mention of Islam as the state religion. In other words, Islam is not the state religion in Indonesia, even though the majority of the population are Muslims. About 87% of the population are Muslim in Indonesia, but the state is not a religious state. It's not like an Islamic state, say, like Saudi Arabia or Iran or Pakistan, which state Islam, as the state religion. So it is not a religious state, or it is not an Islamic state, to be precise. So it is a compromise, a political compromise between Islamic state and secular state. This doesn't mean that the state is against religion or against Islam. In fact, the state, guarantees the freedom of religion, especially those religions considered officially recognized, that we mentioned earlier, how the state plays a role in determining what religion is and what official religions are. Then you have the national slogan, like A Pluribus Unum in America, right? From many one. Bhinneka Tunggal Ika is Sanskrit word from 14th century literature by Sutta Soma. So it was actually Hindu-Buddhist term, but then was incorporated into the national slogan, which means diversity in unity, or unity in diversity. So this is a national slogan of the Indonesian state and peoples. So they are proud of the diverse cultures, ethnic groups, and religions while they are under one state, the Indonesian state. In Indonesia, as well as in other places, you have the recitation of the Quran. Coming back to the Quran a little bit, in Indonesia, where you have the competition of the championship of the recitation of the Quran. So it is one of the cultural things that beside learning about the content of the Quran, they also recite the Quran. Reciting the Quran is an art, in the artistic expression. They believe that the Quran is the word of God, and by reading it or reciting it, and even beautifully, they can get blessing, or mercy and good things coming from God, good fortune coming from God. So this idea of blessing, getting a blessing, seeking for a blessing by reciting scripture is quite prevalent in Indonesian and also other contexts. So you have a championship. In other words, who can recite the Quran best, correctly and beautifully. Then you also have the religious gatherings, where they learn how to read the Quran, how to understand the Quran. Of course, you have a Friday prayers, during the Friday prayer, and then rite of passage. When we talk about other religious tradition, we talk about, birth, wedding, and funeral, right? All these rites of passage, they usually need the recitation of scripture or a priest reciting the scripture, before the people or the congregation, for example. And in Islam, you also have that rite of passage, in relation to the birth, in relation to the wedding, in relation to the death. You have people reciting the Quran. Okay. Let's talk about Muslim festivals, Muslim, religious holidays. So first, the major Muslim festival is the end of the fasting month. It's called the Eid al-Fitr. So basically, this is the celebration of returning to the natural state of being as humans. So they believe after they fast for the whole month of the month of Ramadan, the current month that we are now, they become, pure, they become sinless, and they are ready to get, success and blessings. And it's also family. It's a prayer, congregational prayer, and then you have a sermon, and then you have a family time after that. So this is right after the fasting ends. That's a major Muslim festival. Then you have the second one, Eid al-Adha, which means the holiday or the festival of sacrifice. So this holiday of sacrifice, in this particular moment, they would sacrifice animals, slaughter animals like goats, or camels in Arabic context, and then they commemorate this this act of sacrifice, because they believe that Abraham was about to sacrifice his son. For Muslims, Ismail, especially later interpretations, Ismail, the son of Abraham. So Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, and then God replaced the son with goat. So in order to commemorate this, story, Muslims also have this festival. At the same time, this is during the pilgrimage. During the pilgrimage, where you have an annual pilgrimage, Muslims, about 2 million Muslims around the world, would visit the cities, Mecca and Medina. I already mentioned earlier about this, and then right after this, they would commemorate Abraham and his son, and then they sacrifice an animal. Then after they sacrifice the animal, they would distribute the meat to the poor, to the needy, and so on. So that's the second major festival. You can see also in Southeast Asia. Then you have the birthday of the Prophet. So they also celebrate the birthday of the Prophet. This is something that you don't have it in the classical time. Some say it was not preferred until the medieval time. Maybe following the tradition of many Christians who celebrate Jesus, for example, Muslim also had this celebration of the birth of Muhammad. So birthday of Muhammad is Maulid. So they would do congregation, sermon, and try to remember the teachings of the Prophet. Then you have another one, Isra Mi'raj, the ascendance, the night journey and the ascendance to heaven of Muhammad. So Muhammad, it is believed that Muhammad had a night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem, and then from Jerusalem to heaven. And Muslims celebrate this historical moment, in order to, again, to remember the teachings of Muhammad, their prophet. All right, those are 4 major festivals that you can also find in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Malaysia, and other places as well. But it is across the world. Southeast Asia is quite unique because they also bring their cultures into the celebrations, right? In terms of the food they eat, the meal that they offer, the kind of dresses and clothings and, ornaments and everything are very culturally local and very unique to Southeast Asia. This is one of the examples of the festival of sacrifice in relation to the pilgrimage that I mentioned earlier. So they would, slaughter an animal, and then they had a communal feast, and it's just like Thanksgiving for many Muslims. I also mentioned this one, rites of passage, right? The birth, the wedding, funeral. You see here some pictures of communal meal, and marriage or wedding ceremony. You have the bride and the groom, and the parents of the bride, and then you have this marriage ceremony. And then after that, you have a wedding. It's very culturally interesting. Then you have a communal meal. Yeah, communal meal, meaning that they share food. They cook and they bring the food, and then they share the food. It's called Selamatan. So basically, Selamatan is to get safety. Selamatan is something that you do to get safety, to get security, health and security and prosperity. So Selamatan is to, that they have this gathering and communal gathering, and then they pray before they eat, and then they share the food. And, this is quite unique also in Southeast Asia, but also in other places. When you talk about communal meal, you can find anywhere in the world. But this is rice and all kind of stuff, fruits, vegetables that you would find in Southeast Asia. It's called Selamatan, which is communal meal. All right, so after we talk about food, right, and festivals, let's talk about mystical element of Islam in Southeast Asia, the spirituality, because Islam, like other religions, also emphasizes spiritual dimension, like heart, like you eat the food in order to serve your physical body, but you also need your soul to be fed. And spirituality is one of things that they would also provide. And Neo-Sufism is the term, is a modern term, which suggests that Sufism, spirituality, and Sharia or law are not contradiction. In other words, to pray and to always remember God, to recite the names of God, they believe are something that they would do every day in their everyday life. So spiritualism and law are not contradiction, and many Muslims in Southeast Asia, would follow this combination of ritual and spirituality. Another aspect of Sufism is music. So in Southeast Asia, you have all kind of musical instruments, and also genre. If you are a musician, or if you are interested in arts and musics, or ethnomusicology, for example, you can find different sources and also studies about this. Yeah, a very rich tradition of music, Muslim music in Southeast Asia. And Sufism is one aspect that they also embrace in the music. So they embed spiritual teachings into music. Sufism sometimes also is related to healing. So the healing, there are some problems with people's drug addiction and domestic violence and abuses and all stuff, all kind of problems. They would go to Sufi masters or Sufi brotherhoods where they can get help, like mental health, and then mental health. So they have the tradition of healing all these kind of social problems and individual problems. using different kind of techniques, washing, prayer, recitation of God, and discipline learning, and so on and so forth. So Sufi tradition and healing are very much related in Southeast Asia. In other words, you need to heal the sick not simply by going to the doctor, but you go to a spiritual master. All right, that's the key in this context. Sufism and healing. Then you have modern Sufism. Modern Sufism, which has evolved and developed in the cities, in Jakarta, in Yogyakarta, in Kuala Lumpur, in Singapore, in different cities across Southeast Asia. You will find people very, very modern, but also very, very spiritual. So it's like mega church in the United States or some televangelical movements that emphasize being rich, right? Being rich, being modern, and but is still being Christian. In Islam, you also have this phenomenon of people are modern, very up to date, in their clothes, in their businesses, in their lifestyles, but they are also very spiritual. All right, that's spirituality dimension of Islam. How about law? How about legal aspect of Islam in Southeast Asia? Like things to do, things that you cannot do as a Muslim. You have different sources of law in Southeast Asia. Generally speaking, there are three forms of law in Southeast Asia, and especially in Indonesia, in Malaysia. One is civil law. So civil law comes from the colonial law, like European law, the Dutch law, or the British law. So this Dutch and the British legal systems, were introduced into the colonies, and then they would become part of the legal system of the country. So the British law would become part of the legal system of Malaysia. The Dutch law also would become part of the law of Indonesia because they were colonies before. So you have the colonial laws still, partly enacted in the national laws of post-colonial states in Southeast Asia. Beside that, you have customary law. Customary law means, laws are based on their cultures, their ethnic cultures, like Javanese, Malay, Buginese, Acehnese. All these ethnic cultures also have their own laws, the way they do the wedding, the way they do the funeral, the way they do certain things, meal, all kind of social relations. So it's called the customary laws, the customs. So these laws also play a role in how people's practice their life. Then you have the Islamic law, the Sharia that we already mentioned earlier, the legal aspect of Islam about what to do, what not to do. Like, you're not supposed to eat pork, for example. You're not supposed to drink the intoxicants, for example, things like that. Or bloods, you cannot eat bloods or drink bloods, things like that. The Islamic law would also influence how people practice their everyday life in Southeast Asia. So civil law, customary law, and Islamic law. Of course, these three systems of law that are now in Southeast Asia do not necessarily contradict each other. They actually influence each other. They coexist, sometimes in conflict, but sometimes coexist. So you have a very dynamic relationship between different sources of law. So Islam coming from Middle East, and then you have customary law coming from Southeast Asian indigenous cultures, and then you have the European systems of law also coming in, right? So all this hybrid, system of law, plural system of law in Southeast Asian countries. All right. By now, I think I have talked quite a bit. Let's talk now about family matters, gender relations, right? So family in the Muslim tradition is just like any family, you know, parents and you have children, right? But there's some similar and different aspects of family lives and gender relations that you can find across religious traditions. First of all, it is very important to understand the Qur'anic message about women and men. In the Quran, at least in principle, Muslims believe, men and women are equal before God. In other words, God creates men and women equally. For example, one of the Quranic passages here, we created you male and female, nations and tribes, that, and so on and so forth. And then the most noble of you from God's perspective is the most righteous or the most pious. So it's not based on your gender, even sexuality in some interpretations. It's not based on that. It is based on your good conduct so that God would see. So, and then this is called the Taqwa or piety. So that's how piety or character distinguish one person from another rather than their sexual or gender orientation. That's one point. You have a very dynamic interpretations there, but that's one key topics that we need to understand. And another verse of the Quran, another Quranic chapter says that whoever does good, whether male or female, and is a believer, all such will enter the garden or the paradise. So the notion of paradise, I might not necessarily discuss paradise before. Muslims believe the existence of paradise and hell, so rewards and punishment. So instead of moksha, liberation from being extinct or enlightenment, Muslim usually would aspire to be living in a paradise, and hopefully also they are free from going to the hellfire. So this is quite biblical, in Semitic cultures, the notion of paradise and hell. Also in other cultures, like Zoroastrians also believe in the paradise and hell. But anyway, whoever does good, male or female, and then they believe in God, then they will go to heaven. And this is one of the verses that they would cite in order to suggest that both men and women are equal before God. So they talk about love and blessing and compassion and harmony and peace in relationship. So between parents and children, husband and wives, between friends, neighbors, between leaders or rulers and the subject or followers, and then you can expand this into employers and employees and so on and so forth. So this kind of relationship they called blessing or compassionate relationship. This is again ideal and normative, right? You do have problems and challenges in how to make relationships peaceful and compassionate and loving. It happens to everybody, and it happens to all kind of peoples, regardless of religions. But Muslims are not an exception to this. So they also have kind of health, mental problems, psychological problems that they need to address, so that, for example, they don't have any domestic violence, for example, or divorce for husband and wife. They try to avoid that. But again, problems are there. This is an ideal situation. Muslims are allowed to get divorced and to initiate divorce, men and women, after they try to resolve the conflicts. So you have the court would judge if this initiation of divorce was approved or rejected. But divorce is allowed, even Islamically speaking. So after marriage, they are allowed to get divorced. Of course, the idea of marriage is they would live forever until death would them, take them apart, for example. But still, you do have divorces among Muslim couples. All right. Communal life, I already mentioned about Selamatan, about food, sharing the food, right? And jihad. This is the first time I mentioned jihad, I think. Jihad, right? This is very famous word in the US and in the West and everywhere now. After 9/11, jihad is very overloaded term. Jihad means struggle. So that's it. So struggle, to struggle, and Muslim believe in the struggle in the path of God would give them paradise. And jihad, however, is not confined to physical struggle or armed struggle in the case of defending yourself from any attack from outside, but it's also a spiritual struggle where you can control yourselves. And this is how Muslims understand jihad, not only physical, but also spiritual, moral, and even intellectual jihad, where they study very hard, they try to strive as long as they do this or they do the study in the path of God, and spend their wealth, spend their energy in the path of God, then they are doing jihad, they are performing jihad. One aspect of this is jihad of gender, or gender jihad. This is basically just a term, just a phrase to suggest that Muslim women in Islamic cases, or in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in different places, also have involved, have participated in struggling against gender inequality. Like you have the notion of Muslim feminism, for example, in Southeast Asia. Muslims, women who are struggling to get equal pay, to get equal treatment in work, to get equal voice in politics, and so on and so forth. So they use the term jihad, right, because it's struggle to reach a goal of gender equality, as Muslim believe is the ideal norm in the Qur'an. So gender jihad, that some call. In Indonesia and Malaysia, you have Muslim women, serving political offices, governmental offices. So you had an Indonesian Muslim female president, Megawati. She was the daughter of the first president of Indonesia, Sukarno. Anyway, so she was the women president of Indonesia. And then you also have political leaders of party in Malaysia, also women. And you have many Muslim, politicians, activists, all kind of stuff. So women in Southeast Asia are having a good standing in terms of equality, but of course they are struggling to get this standing, this gender equality. Just to give you a sense that women are not only in the household at private sector, but women have been in the public. And Southeast Asia is a good case for suggesting that women and men are at least in some cases equal. And you have also a Muslim woman judge in Indonesia, so you don't find many in other countries, but in Indonesia you have Muslim women becoming judge in the court. Of course, beside being a president here. All right, how about veiling, the hijab thing, right? So when we talk about Islam, usually people talks about the hijab. Hijab, the head cover, right? Veiling. It's a very complex question, a very complex phenomenon. But to make it short, many Muslims believe that to wear hijab is required by the Quran or in the Quran, and especially toward Muslim women. And then they believe that this is a way of showing the closeness to God, the piety, the modesty. So you have those religious reasons when they wear the veil. Most of Muslim women in Indonesia and Malaysia, they don't cover the whole face. They only cover the hair and then the whole body. In other words, they still have the face open. Some Muslim women in the Middle East, you would see fully cover even the face. It's called niqab. There's another term for that they believe also the Prophet's wives cover the face as well. But Muslims, mainstream Muslim women in Southeast Asia would not cover the faces. They believe that the face is not part of the thing that they should hide from the public. So why wear hijab for them? Religious obligation, religious identity. Some use the term resistant. So they use this in order to show their resistance against the mainstream culture that they believe alien culture, Western culture. So they also wear the hijab to show a new way of life, new Islamic modernity, all kind of reasons, both religious and secular reasons, when they wear the veil. But you do also have many Muslim women not wearing the veil. They say that hijab or head cover or veiling is not an obligation. It is mentioned in the Quran, but it's only for, according to the understanding, only for the wives of Muhammad. So only the wives of Muhammad, and only at the time of that context of Arabia. They believe that that's cultural rather than religious. In other words, they distinguish hijab or veiling as Arabic culture from religious idea of modesty and politeness. So these Muslim women who don't wear hijab in Southeast Asia believe that as long as you are you wear the clothes modestly and politely, socially, using the social norm, not inciting sexual desires and so on and so forth, according to their understanding, then you are actually already performing the obligation of covering. In other words, covering is not physically or literally, but it is more substantively, they believe. As long as morally you are modest and polite, then you are doing fine. So you do have a difference of opinion and practice among Muslims women in Southeast Asia regarding the veil. If you are interested in this question, I have also some references and so on and so forth. Okay. All right. How about music, and performance? So traditional music, modern music, pop musics, you will find any type of music, any type of genre of music you will find in Southeast Asia. And they like this hybrid culture, right? Hybridity, all kind of stuff, as long as they have fun and they enjoy and they entertain using the traditional instruments, traditional songs, and then also bringing some Islamic theme into it, about family, about love, about longing, about heroism and stuff like that. So music and performance is very, very rich in Southeast Asia. I just give you one more thing about arts, which is films, right? One of the very interesting phenomena in the modern time is film using Muslim theme. Films that they call the religious film, and then they have different topics: love, family, friendship, struggle against the Dutch, like this movie, for example. Unfortunately, they are in Indonesian language and or Malay languages. I mean, you know, local language, but they have subtitles. If you're interested in, you know, in this kind of movies using religious theme in Indonesia and Malaysia. One of this is one of the famous ones is called The Verses of Love. The Verses of Love, Ayat-Ayat Cinta, is one of the movies, you know, describing love, shared love, you know, like a polygamous relationship. But again, it is not necessarily agreeing it, but actually criticizing it in some delicate ways. So, and others, okay? That's films. All right, that's Indonesia. So we've covered a lot about Indonesia, Islam in Indonesia. I just want to say briefly, so we talk about the transmission of Islam in Southeast Asia to trades, you know, mystic movements, rulers also trying to convert local peoples after they convert to Islam. Then you have the transmission of the Quran, the scripture, into Southeast Asia. You know, the Quran has to be in Arabic, then they had to translate the Quran into local languages. They had to interpret the Quran in their understanding within their own cultural context, right? But in the modern time, they also had competition of the Quran, how to recite the Quran. They also write the Quran or the calligraphy, you know. So it's a very, very interesting transmission process and localization of Islam in Southeast Asia. In Indonesia in particular, I already mentioned about the 5 pillars, right? The Pancasila. The 5 pillars: belief in one God, humanism, nationalism, democracy, and social justice. So the 5 pillars that they consider the state philosophy, and then they have the constitution that doesn't say anything about Islam as the state religion. So you have that Indonesian nation state influenced by Islamic values, but not so much about Islamic State. All right. Then you have Islamic expressions in family lives, in gender movement, and then lastly in arts, right? In musics and also in films. All right. Let's move on. Let's talk about Islam in Malaysia. All right, Islam in Malaysia. Okay, first of all, Malaysia, right? Malaysia is the state of Malays, the major ethnic groups in this country. You have Malaysia, the peninsular of Malaysia, and then the other part of Sarawak. So you have here, you have states of Malaysia, and then you have Sarawak. Okay, this is the map. And then you have the mainland Southeast Asia up, right? Because Malaysia has the border with Thailand. So Thailand, and you have Malaysia. And this part, you have the island of Borneo. So part of it, northern part of it is Malaysia, but the other parts are Indonesian, part. So you have it, Indonesia and Malaysia were divided by the colonial powers, by the British and the Dutch. So the British part, the British colony would become Malaysia, and the Dutch colony would become Indonesia. Okay, so the borders were created by colonial power. But anyway, so that's how these countries, nation state, were created, colonization. Many of the Malays would become part of Malaysia because they mostly were Malays. So that's why most populations, 60% of the population of Malaysia are Malays. And then you have about 20 or 30% Chinese population, and then you have Indian, and then you have the rest. So that's Malaysia. In terms of demography, they um, they had a constitution that states what Malay is. So a Malay is one who speaks Malay, adheres Malay customs, and embraces Islam. This is quite unique. You don't have this kind of interpretation or constitutional article in other countries and other countries. So Malay is one who speaks Malay, adhere Malay custom, and embrace Islam. In other words, uh, Malays are Muslims, and to become Malay, to become Muslim. So Malay and religion, or Malay ethnic identity and religious identity are one in Malaysia. That's one. It's historical. It's also constitutional. This creates, of course, challenges and problems, but that's the fact. And then you have this categorization, Bumi Putra, the sons of the soil, Orang Asli, the indigenous people, and non-Bumi Putra, which means the foreigners, Chinese, Indians, and so on. And interestingly, Bumi Putra means, the sons of the soil means the Orang Asli and Malays. And then non-indigenous, so indigenous and non-indigenous. This is categorization. This is racial categorization in Malaysia. It is very racial, influence country in terms of the constitution and everyday life as well. But at the same time, you had religious freedom. You had also religious, ethnic and racial collaboration. Compromises and all kind of politics involving race and ethnic identities. So religion and ethnicity are very much alike. Very much dynamic. Very dynamic in Malaysia. You don't have this kind of racialization of Islam in Indonesia, because in Indonesia, I didn't mention there are about 300 ethnic groups, more than 300 ethnic groups, and then more than 300 ethnic languages. In Malaysia, you only have 3 major races, the Malays, the Indian, and the Chinese, and the Indians, and then the rest. So that's why racial politics is very much stronger in Malaysia than in Indonesia. Partly because of the colonial histories, the British and so on. In Malaysia, you have the state philosophy or the state principles. In Indonesia, remember the 5 pillars, right? The 5 pillars, the belief in one God, and humanism, nationalism, democracy, and social justice. In Malaysia, you also have this kind of pillars of the state, the pillars or the principles of the state. Since 1970, they had this one nation. Malaysia is being dedicated to achieving a greater unity of all people, maintaining a democratic way of life, creating a just society in which the wealth of the nation shall be equitably shared, answering a liberal approach to her rich and diverse cultural tradition, and building progressive society which shall be oriented to modern science and technology. Then we, the people of Malaysia, pledge our united efforts to attain these ends, guided by these principles. So this is the principles that they talk about, the RUKUNEGARA, the state principle. Believe in one God, or believe in God, loyalty to king and country, because in Malaysia you had a king's sultan before, Sultan of Perak, Sultan of Johor, and so on, colonized by the British. Then they retain the sultanate form, although their purpose, I mean, their function were quite symbolical in the modern context. They have a prime minister and the states, like the British system, because they use the British system. So loyalty to the king is one of the pillars. You don't have that in Indonesia. You used to have a king or local kingdoms like Majapahit and Sriwijaya and Demak and others in Indonesia, but kingships or kingdoms did not survive the modern times. Only in Yogyakarta, where you still have a one local king, but that's very symbolic as well. Now he's also the governor of one of the provinces in Indonesia. But you don't have like belief or loyalty to king. And the country, yes, the loyalty to the country, but not to the king in Indonesia. In Malaysia, you have the king and prime minister. Upholding the constitution, they have the constitution. And then you have the sovereignty of the law and morality. So the 5 principles that they have are kind of quite different from the Indonesian Pancasila, the 5 pillars, in terms of loyalty to the king, for example, and then the way they frame the pillars is quite different. This is more legalistic here, right? In Indonesia, you have more philosophical, like social justice, democracy, nationalism also there. You have that here. So there's some similar and different aspects of the principles of the state, Indonesia and Malaysia. In Malaysia, you have the administration of Islam. I didn't mention that in Indonesia also you have the Ministry of Religious Affairs, the Department of Religious Affairs. So the governmental institution in charge of religious affairs, mostly about Islam, like Islamic mosque, schools, pilgrimage to Mecca, and others matters, wellness matter. You have that department or ministry of religious affairs in Indonesia. In Malaysia, you have the state Islamic departments as well. This governmental body supervises mosque and Islamic schools. So they kind of have a standardized sermons, Friday sermons. So Muslim countries have Friday sermons. So they would go to mosque on Fridays to pray and to listen to the sermon. And then these sermons in Malaysia have to be standardized, according to the states. Islamic schools are supervised by these departments. Islamic law with moral police, they also is enacted in Malaysia. They try to do it as much as possible. For example, fasting. So in terms of fasting, the state also requires Muslims to fast. You don't have that in Indonesia, like the state, enforcing you to fast. In Malaysia, there's some aspect of moral police, because Islam is the state religion in Malaysia. In Indonesia, Islam is not a state religion, even though Islam is the religion of the majority of the people, because of different history and different demography and different cultures, different size of the people. Indonesia has 260 million people. Malaysia around 35 millions. So in terms of size, Indonesia is much larger. And then in terms of diversity, also ethnically, it's also more diverse. But anyway, so to give you some comparative dimension of it. Then you have this Department of Religious Affairs, Islamic Affair. So mostly Islamic affair here. They also collect and distribute the alms, the zakat, the alms, the charity that we talk about. One of the pillars of Islam, right, is giving alms. So the government, collect and distribute the alms to the needy. They also certify those authorized to preach. So not everyone can preach Islam in Malaysia. They need to have a certification in order to preach what is Islam. The government leaders at the federal level also try to ensure that Islamic laws are consistent across the states. So they move toward centralization, centralized government in Malaysia. They also have this Institute for Islamic Understanding under the Office of Prime Minister. They carry out conferences on Islam. They publish regular religious opinions or discussions, television programs, and so on and so forth. They are famous with, with this notion of Dakwah Movement. Dakwah means Islamic call or Islamic mission. So the movement for making people more Islamic, maybe influenced by the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79 and some Islamic movements from India. This Dakwah movement, the movement for making Islam more, spread to the society, is basically urban phenomenon. An urban phenomenon meaning, they are educated in schools and universities and colleges. They become more and more Islamized, and then they also want to move and, organize themselves in order to Islamize society, larger society. Then you also have some other more conservative organizations in terms of how they dress, like following the Arabic style of how they dress, how they eat, and they kind of have a smaller, self-sufficient economic system. And this is all organizations. Then you also have transnational organizations like Jamaat Tabligh from India. Indian Muslims and many urban Malay youth also have become members of this Islamic organization, transnational Islamic organization, the Community of Islamic Mission, Jamaat Tabligh. This particular organization is famous now under the COVID-19 crisis, because in Kuala Lumpur, in the city of Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, recently this organization held a huge congregation, regardless of this prohibition of meeting and gathering, and that's how it's a concerning many peoples in Malaysia and everywhere in Southeast Asia. But anyway, just to give you one contemporary issues regarding the COVID-19 crisis and how some Muslims, don't necessarily follow these guidelines not to gather, and the notion of social distancing and physical distancing. But anyway, this is quite unique because most mosque and Islamic organizations, they follow this social distancing and physical distancing. They close their mosque, they don't do the gatherings in the mosque, and then they stay home instead. This is just one of the organizations that that looks quite different and unique in the understanding of Islam. Then you have Sufi brotherhoods in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia and Malaysia. I give you some names here. Don't worry about the names. How Sufi movements survive the modern time. So from the early time where you have the transmission of Islam into Southeast Asia, into the modern time, now you have also Sufi movements, mystical, spiritual movements and organizations in different parts of Southeast Asia. They also embrace the traditional ways of mysticism and the modern ways of how to organize their teachings, their preachings, their training, their disciplines, and so on. All right, so that's the Sufis and state involving themselves into managing Islamic affairs in Malaysia. But, arts is there, right? Musical ensemble in Malaysia. This is one of the, musical performance, dance and musical performance. in Malaysia. I took this picture 2005. It's a you have a celebration, in the state of Kelantan. It's near Thailand. And this particular theater and music and performance is amazing because you had colors, you have men and women, you have old people, young people, children's, and you have traditional musics, and you have some modern instrument as well, all kind of. So this is really huge thing. One of the moments where they celebrate the cultural events. Yeah, it's also a proud moment for the Malay Islamic heritage. You have here the drum, right? The traditional drum is one of the traditional drums. They use this drum also to call to prayer. In many mosques in Southeast Asia, they use the drum to sign that the time to pray comes. So, and then you have the call to pray in Arabic after the drum. So you have the one case of combining local culture and Islam, right? Using the badug. It's called badug, the drum, the traditional drum. Not simply by reciting the call to pray in Arabic, but you also use the traditional instrument. All right. In Indonesia, in Malaysia, you have some common characteristic, also differences. So we talk about this, the Dutch colonized the East Indies, or the Netherlands Indies, that would become Indonesia. The British would colonize the Malay part, that would become Malaysia. And Singapore, Singapore, right? Singapore. So in Singapore used to be part of Malaysia, but then they become independent and create its own country. It's a state country, mostly Chinese there. So you have Singapore, but you also have Malays Muslim in Singapore. You also have Brunei Darussalam, also part of the British colony, and then it becomes a monarchy, Islamic monarchy, a small country. It's an Islamic monarchy in Southeast Asia. I don't talk about Brunei Darussalam specifically, but if you're interested in this particular country, let me know. So the Dutch and the British colonized this, and then they had the colonial legacies in these countries in terms of law, in terms of education, in terms of language, right? Some aspect of cultures as well. Just the one. Number two, non-state Islamization versus state Islamization. What it means is, what the non-state Islamization means that they try to make people Islamic, meaning the state, the non-state, the society, non-governmental organization. So people Islamize the people. State Islamization, the state Islamize the people. So in other words, the state also plays a role in making sure that people are Islamic, through supporting mosques, Islamic schools, pilgrimage, almsgiving and distributions, right? And aspect of arts and cultures also sponsored by the state. So the state also plays a role in the religious lives of the people. Non-state Islamization means that the people themselves, without the need of the state involvement, and they are non-governmental, they are self-sufficient, confident organizations, try to Islamize people in their own ways without the support of the government. So that's just a term, Islamization from below or top. Top-down Islamization, you can say that, right? Ethnicity is very much important part of Malaysian politics and culture, like race, being Malay and being Muslim in Malaysia. In Indonesia, you don't have that. Being Javanese, you don't have to be a Muslim, for example. Being Buginese, mostly Muslim, but they also have non-Muslim Buginese or other ethnic groups. You don't have like Muslims all the time. You have other religious peoples as well. Christians. I mean, you have Roman Catholics, Christians, Protestant Christians, and then you have Hindus, Buddhists, Confucians, and others in Indonesia. So you don't have one particular religion associated with one particular ethnic group. In Malaysia, being Malay is being Muslim, right? That's a different thing. And then you have different degree in cultural plurality. So because of the ethnic groups are more abundant or diverse in Indonesia, more than 300 ethnic groups. So Indonesia becomes more diverse culturally speaking, ethnically speaking, in terms of their languages and cultures. Malaysia, you have three major races, right? Malay, Chinese, and Indians. So, and then you of course have other ethnic groups, but the majority are those three. And then you have also different degree in modernization, because Malaysia was colonized by the British. Um, um, they become more modern. The English is much better, comparatively speaking, with many Indonesians. The Dutch didn't really teach the Dutch language to the people. So Dutch did not become like a popular language in Indonesia, while English had become a popular language in Malaysia. Economically speaking, Malaysia is a little bit better off because of this size of the population and the centralized economic system and so on. So you have more modern, more economic progress in Malaysia than in Indonesia, where you have a larger population, larger size of the country, with 2/3 of the oceans and 17,000 islands in Indonesia. So it's a much more to govern and to manage. So economically speaking, you still have a disparity in Indonesia. All right, so there's some aspects of differences and similarities between these good countries. All right, I should stop lecturing about Indonesia and Malaysia. We will talk about Muslims as minorities Thursday. All right, so for now, Muslims as majority population in Indonesia, about 87% of the population Muslims, and Malaysia about 60% population of the population are Muslims. So that's how Islam is practiced and and especially with relate to the government and the society at large. I should stop here. We have still 5 minutes. And I'm going to talk about the paper, the critical analysis paper. And if you had any question about Islam in these two countries, you're welcome to ask me here. And attendance, please. And if you are interested to to stay a little bit more, let's talk about our critical analysis essay, which is due on Saturday.
I have a quick question, Professor.
Oh, go ahead, please.
So I know we need a works cited or a bibliography. Does it matter, or do you have like how many books we should use for our project? Is it okay if we just use one? Do you want us to use at least like two, or does it matter?
I see. Very good. Thank you for that. For your critical analysis paper, I would expect, two at least or more, because if you just use one, it's like your weekly essay, right? When you had a weekly essay, you basically just pick one reading and then you give response, right? I believe that for critical analysis essay, you need more than one, maybe, three would be good number, because at least you can have a different sources for discussing one particular question or topic, okay? So if you had, let's say, three, either articles or books, just use the one that I have on Ireland. But if you can also use Gestor or other search engines or ebooks without going to the library, right? You can certainly use other sources, and you can use online sources, but be careful about online sources, all right? Especially, you know, there are all kind of stuff there, and then use the credible one, the reliable sources. So I would say 3 would be good number for your sources, for your essay. And of course, more are, you know, it depends on the topics. More would be better. But I don't really see that as the main thing. But please make sure that you have more than just 2. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Noah. Good question. Any other question about essay, about critical analysis paper? So it's a 4 or 5 pages, double space for undergraduate students. I believe 6 to 7 pages for the graduate students. And what else about that? Oh, make sure you have a, you know, you have a introduction and then discussion and conclusion, right? And if you had a thesis statement would be good. You know, thesis statement, meaning, you know, like your argument, right? Your argument, what you want to say, like the in this paper, you have that one argument that you elaborate in your essay. So that make it a stronger critical analysis essay. I would evaluate or assess your, you know, clarity, your, you know, argument, writing style, some kind of, you know, like grammatical thing, although it's not, but I would expect you to reread and, you know, before you submit, make sure that you make it good in terms of the writing style, and use footnote or in text, body text footnote, that's fine too, or end notes is fine as long as you are consistent. And then you put also bibliography or works cited at the end. What else? So I already gave you the rubric, right? So you read the rubric, and the suggested question that I have is very general. You can make it more specific according to your particular, you know, interest, and you can also have your own question for sure, besides the one that I provide. But please ask me first if you are going to write something beyond the suggested questions. And if I approve, and, you know, you can go ahead, and that's fine too. All right, what else about the essay? I know this is the first time for many of you to write about religions, you know, academically, but yeah, start from reading some of the from the chapters and book chapters and articles about a question that you are interested in, and from reading, then you can have an idea, and then you can make an outline yourself, right? You know, main ideas, supporting ideas, right? You can make a paragraph. In a one paragraph, you have one main idea and then supporting ideas, okay? So you make sure that you have this main idea and supporting ideas, and then give evidence to your argument, right? Illustrations, like cases, examples, like specific examples. When you make a very general statements, make sure that you support this general statement with specific cases or names or organizations or individuals, you know, in particular time and place. All right, that's a
Professor,
good. Yes, go ahead.
just to clarify, MLA format is fine for the essay?
Say it again, please. Sorry, I didn't understand well.
Just to clarify, MLA format is fine for the essay?
Oh, Emily. Yes, that is fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yep. The format, you can have an MLA or another one. As long as you are consistent, you're fine. Good. I'm glad you asked that. Any other question? Thank you, Olympia.
Yes, I'm sorry. I have a quick question. For the critical paper, can we state in first person if we have an opinion, or should we keep it in third person?
That's a writing style. it depends on what the topic. Yeah, the topic. If it is, if it is also about how you argue yourself, it's fine, but don't use too much I think, use the third person would be better in a critical analysis paper. It is different from your weekly essays. Weekly essay is your response, right? You can use I a lot there, which is fine. But in a critical analysis essay, I would expect less I. If you had to avoid, that would be better. All right, Kenya?
Okay. Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other question about the critical analysis essay? All right, you can email me for sure. Maybe more sources if you, if you need other sources, just email me. I would be happy to help you in trying to find more sources for you if you don't find sources. But I think the readings on iLearn are more than enough to you to use in order to answer and write your critical analysis essay. All right, good luck. That's why I have extended the due date so that you can have more time to write until Saturday. And of course the weekly essays, you can still do it later on, the 5 weekly essays, you can still submit the rest the next weeks. You don't have to do it now. So if you want to focus on your critical analysis essay, I would support that. I would encourage you to do that for now, so that you can have a better critical analysis essay. All right, good luck with your essay and with your research. And again, thank you so much for joining the lecture today. Stay safe and healthy as always, and I'll see you again on Thursday. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.